The Nile is lower than anyone remembers. The fields are cracking beneath the sun. Mud canals hold more dust than water. Your family has grain for days, not months. The king lives hundreds of miles away. His officials still demand what they can. Your village waits for a flood. The flood does not come high enough. This is Egypt around 2200 BCE, and survival has suddenly become uncertain. For centuries, the Nile made Egypt possible. Its annual flood renewed exhausted farmland. Silt turned desert edges into black soil. Farmers planted after the waters withdrew. Granaries stored part of the harvest. Taxes moved grain toward temples and government. That system could absorb a bad year, but several bad years were different. A river civilization depends on rhythm. Break the rhythm and everything becomes fragile. So was this Egypt's worst time? There is no single objective answer. A royal official and farmer suffered differently. Upper Egypt and the Delta differed too. But one period stands out. Historians call it the First Intermediate Period. It followed the collapse of the Old Kingdom. The transition began around 2200 BCE. Exact dates remain debated by Egyptologists. The famous Pyramid Age was ending. Central royal power was weakening. Provincial elites were becoming more independent, and the climate was becoming less forgiving. The combination was brutally dangerous. To understand it, start with water. Egypt receives almost no useful rainfall. The Nile brings water from far south. Its flood once arrived every summer. The rise depended on African monsoon rains. Strong rains produced a generous inundation. Weak rains meant a lower flood. Too much water could also destroy crops. Egyptians needed a narrow middle ground. They watched river levels carefully. Nilometers later measured changing heights, but measurement could not create water. Around 2200 BCE, something larger was happening. Climate records show widespread aridification. Scientists call it the 4.2 kiloyear event. It affected regions across the Old World. The timing and severity varied locally. Northeast Africa became noticeably drier. Lake sediments preserve evidence of the shift. Marine cores record changing dust levels. Speleothems preserve changes in ancient rainfall. No single record tells Egypt's whole story. Together, they suggest serious environmental stress. The Nile likely experienced repeated low floods. For farmers, that meant shrinking fields. Less flooded land meant less grain. Less grain meant smaller household reserves. Smaller reserves meant faster hunger. And hunger transforms every political weakness. Imagine watching the flood marks stop early. Your father remembers higher water. Your grandmother remembers fuller canals. Now exposed mud dries into hard plates. Seeds go into poorer soil. Some never germinate. Others produce thin heads of grain. The harvest arrives small. Taxes do not disappear automatically. Officials still need food for institutions. Temples still employ workers and priests. Local rulers still support armed retainers. Everyone is competing for the same shortage. That is where state weakness matters. A strong government can redistribute reserves. It can move grain between regions. It can repair canals at scale. It can organize labor during emergencies. But Old Kingdom authority was fragmenting. Egypt's 6th dynasty was nearing its end. Pepi II ruled for an unusually long time. Ancient king lists give complicated figures. His exact reign length remains disputed. But succession after him was unstable. Short reigns followed long royal continuity. The center could not dominate as before. Provincial governors had gained local power. Egyptologists call many of them nomarchs. Their offices increasingly became hereditary. Their tombs became larger and more ambitious. Their inscriptions celebrated local achievements. That tells us something important. People were looking closer to home. A distant pharaoh mattered less during crisis. The local granary mattered more. The local canal mattered more. The local strongman mattered more. If he had grain, you listened. If he had soldiers, you obeyed. If he protected irrigation, you supported him. Political loyalty followed survival. One extraordinary voice comes from Ankhtifi. He governed in southern Upper Egypt. His tomb inscription boasts about famine relief. Ankhtifi describes feeding hungry communities. He portrays himself as a savior. He even claims neighboring regions starved. The language is dramatic and self-promotional. Officials loved exaggerating their own greatness, so historians treat the inscription cautiously. Still, its imagery is difficult to ignore. Hunger had become politically meaningful. Feeding people created legitimacy. Grain was not merely food, it was power measured in baskets. A full granary could buy loyalty. An empty granary could destroy authority. What did ordinary Egyptians actually eat? Bread was a daily foundation. Beer supplied calories and safer liquid. Onions, legumes, dates, and vegetables mattered. Fish could supplement local diets. Meat was far less common. During shortages, everything became narrower. Bread became smaller or less frequent. Beer became thinner. Stored legumes disappeared. Livestock became too valuable to slaughter. Seed grain became dangerously tempting. Eat it now and survive today. Save it and gamble on next year. That is how famine traps families. Every choice damages another future choice. Parents reduce their own portions. Children become more vulnerable to disease. Weakened bodies recover slowly from infection. A minor wound becomes more dangerous. Pregnancy becomes harder. Infant survival becomes less certain. Work becomes physically exhausting. And farming requires enormous physical effort. Now add social inequality. Not everyone entered famine equally. Officials had access to institutional stores. Temples controlled land and food. Wealthy households owned livestock and servants. Poor laborers relied on daily distributions. A shortage could widen every difference. The rich might eat less variety. The poor might stop eating enough. That is why Egypt suffered is misleading. Some Egyptians suffered catastrophically. Others remained comparatively protected. Archaeology reveals regional variation. Some provinces appear surprisingly resilient. Local administration sometimes continued effectively. Craft production did not vanish everywhere. Tombs were still built. People still married and raised children. Markets and exchange continued. Egypt did not become an empty wasteland. The collapse was uneven. That makes the story more frightening. Civilization can continue while individuals starve. A temple can function beside desperate villages. An official can build a tomb during scarcity. A scribe can record accounts normally. Meanwhile, a laborer sells possessions for grain. Collapse rarely looks like one dramatic explosion. It looks like systems thinning out. Fewer reserves, fewer repairs, fewer safe choices, more local conflict, more dependence on whoever still has resources. Political fragmentation deepened the uncertainty. Kings continued claiming authority in the north. Herakleopolis became an important royal center. In the south, Thebes grew stronger. Local Theban rulers expanded their territory. The Ankhtifi family became increasingly powerful. Egypt was no longer governed as one machine. Competing courts claimed legitimate kingship. That meant competing taxation and military demands. Travel could become more dangerous. Trade routes became harder to guarantee. Officials could change allegiance. Border zones became unstable. A farmer might barely understand royal politics, but he understood armed men arriving. He understood grain being requisitioned. He understood canals left unrepaired. He understood sons being drawn into conflict. Political fragmentation enters life through small doors. It enters as missing food. It enters as delayed irrigation. It enters as unsafe roads. It enters as fear after sunset. Did Egypt descend into total civil war? The evidence does not support simple chaos. Later, Egyptian literature paints terrifying pictures. Those texts became famous for social reversal. The rich become poor. The poor seize wealth. The river is described as blood. Order appears turned upside down. For generations, some readers treated these literally. That approach is now considered too simple. Take the admonitions of Ippur. Its surviving manuscript is much later. Its composition date is uncertain. It is not a newspaper from 2200 BCE. It belongs to Egyptian literary tradition. Its disasters may be rhetorical. They express fear about broken social order. That still tells us something. Egyptians remembered disorder as a nightmare. Their ideal world depended on Ma'at. Ma'at meant truth, balance, and proper order. The king was supposed to preserve it. Reliable floods fit that worldview. Stable offices fit that worldview. Justice fit that worldview. Famine felt like cosmic failure. Political division felt like cosmic failure. The crisis was therefore psychological too. The world no longer behaved correctly. That can be more frightening than hunger. A predictable hardship can be planned around. An unpredictable system destroys planning itself. Will the flood rise next year? Will your ruler still control this town? Will the road remain safe? Will grain prices rise again? Will soldiers return? Nobody can answer confidently. That uncertainty changes human behavior. Families hoard what they can, communities guard local resources, elites fortify their influence, people depend more heavily on kin, long-distance trust becomes harder, local identity becomes stronger, even burial practices reflect changing society. Old Kingdom royal monuments were enormous projects. Pyramids advertised centralized royal capacity. By the first intermediate period, priorities shifted. Provincial cemeteries became increasingly important. Local elites advertised their own authority. Their tomb biographies praised feeding dependents. They praised protecting towns. They praised digging canals. They praised maintaining order. Why boast about those things? Because people feared their absence. An inscription celebrates what society desperately needs: food, water, protection, justice, continuity. The crisis also changed Egyptian politics permanently. Thebes continued expanding northward. Conflict with Herakleopolitan rulers intensified. Eventually, Mentuhotep II prevailed. Around 2055 BCE, Egypt was reunified. That date marks the Middle Kingdom's beginning. The exact process took time. Reunification did not magically erase hardship, but centralized government returned more strongly. Royal ideology changed with the experience. Kings emphasized care, order, and provisioning. Officials emphasized responsibility toward dependence. The memory of fragmentation became political ammunition. Later rulers had a lesson. A pharaoh could not only be divine, he had to make the system work. That meant canals, that meant grain, that meant justice, that meant keeping local elites controlled. The state learned from near failure. But what about the climate? The 4.2 kilo-year event eventually eased. Nile conditions became more favorable again. Yet environmental recovery alone was insufficient. Political rebuilding required decades. Trust had to be reconstructed. Networks had to reconnect. Authority had to become believable again. This is why collapse has no single cause. Drought alone did not destroy Egypt. A weak king alone did not either. Provincial ambition alone was insufficient. Population pressure may have mattered too. Administrative structure mattered. Stored grain mattered. Irrigation maintenance mattered. Regional geography mattered. The disaster emerged from interactions. Climate stress struck political weakness. Political weakness reduced crisis response. Poor response deepened local competition. Competition weakened central authority further. That is a feedback loop, and feedback loops are dangerous. They turn problems into systems. Could you personally survive this period? Your chances depended heavily on location. A well-managed province improved your odds. Access to a local granary mattered enormously. Strong family networks helped. A skilled occupation could help. Temple connections could help. Being wealthy helped most. But even privilege had limits. No official could order the Nile higher. No priest could command Ethiopian rainfall. No pharaoh could negotiate with a drought. Ancient Egyptians understood divine explanations differently. They performed rituals for cosmic stability. They made offerings to gods. They maintained temples. They asked divine forces for protection. These acts gave meaning to uncertainty, but practical survival still required grain. Religion and logistics existed together. A prayer could comfort you. A filled granary could feed you. A repaired canal could save your harvest. That is what made the period brutal. The problem was not one invading army. It was not one plague. It was not one evil ruler. It was the failure of predictability itself. The river became less dependable. The state became less dependable. Trade became less dependable. Security became less dependable. Your future became harder to calculate, and humans hate uncertain futures. We build routines around expectations. Ancient Egyptians built an entire civilization around one. The Nile will rise, the fields will flood, the grain will grow, the taxes will be collected, the gods will remain honored, the king will maintain order. Then several parts stopped feeling guaranteed. That is when an ordinary year becomes terrifying, not because every day contains violence, but because every season becomes a question. Egypt survived. That matters. The civilization did not disappear. Its writing continued. Its religion continued, its language continued evolving, its institutions were rebuilt, the Middle Kingdom became extraordinarily sophisticated, Egypt would endure for nearly 2 more millennia, so calling this the end would be wrong. It was a rupture, not extinction, and that may be the deeper lesson. The worst time is not always final collapse. Sometimes it is living between stable worlds. You remember how things used to work. You cannot trust how they work now. You do not know what replaces them. The monuments are still standing. The gods still have names. The river is still flowing, but the old guarantees are gone. Around 2200 BCE, that uncertainty became daily life. For many Egyptians, hunger was only one danger. The greater terror was not knowing what followed. A civilization built on rhythm lost its rhythm, and survival meant waiting for the Nile to remember.